The moment Ida Blackwell rode through the gap in James Hale's cedar fence with a bawling red calf trotting alongside her mare, she had no idea she was riding straight into the rest of her life. The morning had started the way most mornings did on the Blackwell homestead, with too much work and not enough hands. Ida had risen before the sun cracked the horizon over the Texas hill country, pulled on her worn leather boots, and gone out to feed the chickens and check on her small herd of 5 cattle, which was all she had managed to build since her father passed 2 winters ago. The year was 1878, and the land around Caldwell County was still raw, still fighting to decide what it wanted to be, whether it would swallow people whole or reward them for their stubbornness. Ida was 24 years old, and stubborn was perhaps the kindest word anyone had ever used to describe her. She had dark hair the color of well-oiled saddle leather, brown eyes that missed very little, and hands that were calloused from honest work. She was not the kind of woman who waited for someone else to solve her problems, and that particular quality had served her well out here, even if it had earned her a reputation in town as being overly independent for a woman of her age. Her nearest neighbor was a man named James Hale, whose property bordered hers to the east, separated by a stretch of scrubby cedar and a creek that dried to a trickle every summer. She knew of him the way you knew of a distant storm, by reputation mostly, and by the occasional glimpse of dust rising from his land when he ran his cattle. He was said to be a fair man, quiet, and someone who kept to himself. She had seen him twice in town, once at the feed store and once at the post office, but they had never exchanged more than a nod. He was perhaps 30, maybe a year or two older, with broad shoulders and a way of moving that suggested he had never once rushed anywhere in his life, because he had learned that patience got things done better than hurry. That morning, while Ida was making her first pass along the fence line that divided her land from the open grassland to the south, she found the calf. It was young, maybe 6 weeks old, spotted red and white, and it was standing on the wrong side of a broken fence rail with its legs trembling, and its voice carrying across the flat land in that particular plaintive way that young animals have when they cannot find their mothers. It had no brand on it yet, but the coloring was consistent with the Hereford crosses she had seen on James Hale's property during the spring. She had watched his herd move through the valley more than once. She dismounted, examined the calf carefully, and made a quick decision. She could leave it, but a calf this young alone on open land was as good as dead. Coyotes were active and bold this time of year, and the little animal was already showing signs of distress. She could try to confine it somehow and ride to town to find out who it belonged to, but that would take hours, and the calf might not survive the wait. Or she could do what made the most sense and ride it over to Hale's property herself. She was a practical woman. She chose the most practical option. Getting the calf moving was a project in itself. Ida was experienced with cattle. Her father had run a modest operation before his lungs gave out, but a young calf that has been separated from its mother is not a cooperative creature. It pulled backward, it sat down, it bawled so loudly she was certain they could hear it in town. She fashioned a loose rope lead and worked with steady patience, letting the animal settle between bouts of movement, speaking to it in a low, even voice, her tone firm but gentle. Eventually, after nearly 40 minutes of coaxing and repositioning, she had the calf walking alongside her mare with something close to acceptance. It was a 2-mile ride to the nearest point of James Hale's fence line, and another half-mile along that fence to find the gap where the calf had likely crossed through. The gap was obvious once she found it, 2 posts leaning inward and the wire between them sagging nearly to the ground. She noted that the wire had not snapped on its own but had been pulled loose on one side, probably by a large animal pushing against it. She filed that observation away as she encouraged the calf through the gap and onto Hale's property. She saw the ranch house from a distance. It was a solid structure, more substantial than her own modest cabin, built from limestone and timber with a covered porch running along the front. There were two outbuildings, a proper barn with red-painted doors that had seen some weathering, a horse corral with 6 horses moving in the morning light, and what appeared to be a bunkhouse off to the north side, which meant Hale employed at least some hired hands. The whole spread had the look of a place that was cared for, tended to with attention even if not with excess. She was perhaps 100 yards from the barn when she heard a screen door open on the ranch house, and then James Hale stepped off the porch. He had a coffee cup in his hand and he was not wearing his hat yet, which meant she had caught him early, before the day had truly started for him. He stood on the porch steps for a moment, clearly trying to determine what he was seeing: a woman on a bay mare, leading a calf across his pasture at 7:30 in the morning. Then he set the coffee cup down on the porch railing and walked toward her. Ida had not given much thought to how she would explain herself, because the situation seemed self-explanatory to her. She pulled up her mare and waited for him to close the distance. He was taller than she had registered from her brief sightings in town, lean but not thin, with the kind of build that came from actual labor rather than simply being young. He had dark brown hair, a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days, and gray eyes that she noticed even from a distance because they caught the morning light in a particular way. He was wearing worn denim trousers, a plain work shirt with the sleeves already rolled to the elbows, and his boots but no spurs. He looked like a man who had been up for an hour already, which meant they had that much in common. He stopped about 10 feet from her, looked at the calf, looked at her and said, "That's mine." "That is what I figured," Ida said. "Found it on the south side of your fence near the creek bend, 2 posts down and the wire pulled loose. The calf had wandered about a 1/4 mile onto open grass." He looked at the calf again, and she could see him doing the quick mental accounting that any rancher did, checking the animal's condition, estimating how long it had been separated, assessing whether it needed immediate medical attention. He moved toward the calf slowly, the way a person does who understands animals well enough not to startle them, and he ran his hand along the calf's neck and flank, checked its eyes, looked at its hooves. "She is all right," he said, more to himself than to her. "Scared, but all right." "She was bawling something terrible when I found her," Ida said. "I worked with her for almost an hour to get her moving." He looked up at her then, and the expression on his face shifted. It was not dramatic. He was not the kind of man who wore his reactions loudly, but something changed in his eyes, something that became more attentive, more genuinely interested. "You worked her alone," he said. "There is only me," Ida replied simply. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the rope lead she had fashioned around the calf's neck, a careful knot properly done, positioned so as not to chafe the animal. He looked at the way her mare was standing calm, loose-limbed, clearly not agitated by the calf's occasional fussing, which told him something about how the horse was trained and how the woman managed her animals. He looked at her hands on the reins. Something moved across his face, quiet and deliberate, like a man who has just arrived at a decision that surprised him with its clarity. "I am James Hale," he said. "I know," she said. "I am Ida Blackwell. My property borders yours to the west." "I know," he said, and the corner of his mouth turned up just slightly, not quite a smile, but the beginning of one. "Would you like some coffee, Miss Blackwell, after all that work?" Ida had told herself she would simply return the calf and be on her way. She had her own morning chores waiting, her own fences to check, her own animals to tend. But the morning was cool and the ride had been longer than she expected, and she had been awake since before dawn. "I would not say no to coffee," she said. She tied her mare to the hitching post near the barn while he put the calf in a small holding pen and went to retrieve the mother, who had been lowing near the back fence since the previous evening by the sound of it. Ida watched him work. He moved with the same quiet efficiency she had noticed when he walked toward her, no wasted motion, no drama, just a man who knew what needed doing and did it. Within 10 minutes the calf was nursing and the mother had stopped her distressed sounds, and the crisis, such as it was, had been resolved. He washed his hands at the pump near the barn and led her up to the porch, where he disappeared inside and came back with 2 tin mugs of coffee. He handed her one and leaned against the porch post and looked out at his pasture land the way that men who work land tend to do, always reading it, always assessing. "How long have you been on the Blackwell property?" he asked. "My father filed the claim in 1869, she said. "I was raised there. He passed 2 years ago and I have been running it since." "Alone," he said. It was not a question, but it also was not said with condescension. It was said the way a person states an observation that earns someone else respect. "Alone," she confirmed. "I have 5 head of cattle and a kitchen garden and 60 acres of pasture that I lease out to a neighbor for hay cutting in exchange for help with seasonal work. I manage." "I can see that you do," he said. They drank their coffee in a silence that was not uncomfortable. Below the porch the land rolled out in the soft early morning light, golden and lavender where the grasses caught it, and from somewhere in the cedar breaks, a mockingbird was working through its entire repertoire with the dedicated ambition of a creature that has all the time in the world. Ida noticed that James Hale was not the kind of man who filled silence with noise just to prove he was present, and she found that she appreciated that. "Your south fence line needs attention," she said. "Not just the 2 posts I found down. There is a whole section where the cedar posts have begun to rot at the base. You will lose more animals if it is not addressed before autumn." He turned to look at her with an expression that was part surprised and part something else, something warmer. "You assessed my fence line while you were retrieving my calf," he said. "I assess everything I ride past," she said. "It is how I stay ahead of problems on my own land." "Good practice," he said. Then after a brief pause, "What do you do about rotting posts? Cedar goes faster than you would think out here." And just like that, they were talking, really talking, about the practical details of running land in Caldwell County, about cattle breeds and fence maintenance, and the trouble with the summer droughts and the particular challenge of keeping a small operation solvent when the big cattle operations were expanding their ranges. She was surprised by how easy the conversation was, and she suspected he was surprised too, though he showed it less. He asked questions that were precise and interested, not the vague, polite questions that people in town asked when they were only being courteous. He listened to her answers the way a person listens when the answer actually matters to them. When she finally rose to leave and the sun was already a couple of hours clear of the horizon, he walked her to her horse and untied the mare himself, which was a small courtesy but one she noticed. "I would like to come see that fence section you mentioned," he said as she mounted. "Would that be acceptable, coming onto your property to look from your side?" "It is your fence," she said. "You have every right to assess it from either side." "I am asking as a courtesy," he said, looking up at her with those gray eyes steady and direct. "Not because I think I need permission." She held his gaze for a moment. "The courtesy is noted," she said. "Come whenever you like." She rode back to her property with the mare moving at an easy pace, and she did not think about James Hale any more than was necessary for the rest of the day. She was practical. She had work to do. But that evening, when she sat on her own porch watching the sun go down behind the western hills, she found herself noticing how quiet it was in a way she had not particularly noticed before. He came 2 days later. She was in her kitchen garden when she heard the hoofbeats, and she straightened and pushed the hair back from her face with the back of her wrist, which left a small smear of earth on her forehead that she did not know about. He rode up on a dark bay gelding that moved with a long, clean stride, and he pulled up at the garden gate and tipped his hat. "Morning, Miss Blackwell." "Morning," she said. "The south fence line is that direction." She pointed east toward the creek. The corner of his mouth lifted. "I know where it is." She set down her hand cultivator, wiped her hands on her work apron, and walked him over to the fence section she had noted. He inspected each post methodically, testing the base of every cedar with the toe of his boot, noting where the rot had advanced, estimating the structural integrity of the wire. He had a small notebook in his breast pocket, and he made marks in it, which she respected, A man who wrote things down was a man who was serious about accuracy. "You were right," he said. 14 posts need replacing minimum, and this whole east-facing run needs new wire where it has oxidized. I will send a hand out to start on it this week." "I was right," she said simply, not with vanity but with the satisfaction of someone who has made a correct assessment and has it confirmed. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw him actually smile, a full smile, not just the corner of the mouth suggestion of one, and it changed his face considerably. He looked younger when he smiled and less solemn, and something in her chest did a small unexpected thing that she chose to categorize as the effect of having skipped breakfast. "Would you like to walk the rest of the line?" she offered. "I was going to check it myself this afternoon anyway." "I would," he said. They walked the full length of the shared fence line together, a distance of nearly a mile, and they talked the entire way. He told her he had bought the property in 1874 from a man who had let the land get ahead of him, that he had spent the first 2 years just clearing cedar and repairing what had been allowed to deteriorate. He had grown up in Missouri, the son of a farmer, and had come to Texas because the land was cheaper and the sky was bigger, his words. She found she liked that he described it that way. The sky is bigger. Not the opportunity is greater or the cattle prices are favorable, but the sky is bigger. She told him about her father, Frank Blackwell, who had been a stubborn, optimistic man, who believed that any land could be made to yield if you worked it properly and treated it with respect. She told him about the 2 years since his death, about learning as she went, about the mistakes she had made and the things she had figured out, about how she had lost one of her cattle to a broken leg last spring and had to make the hard decision herself with no one else there to do it, and how afterward she had sat on the porch for an hour and allowed herself to cry about it and then gotten up and gone on because that was the only available option. He was quiet for a moment after she said that, and then he said, "That is harder than most people understand." "It is just ranching," she said. "It is not just ranching," he said. "Not when you are doing it alone. There is a weight to making every decision yourself with no one to share it." She looked at him. He was not looking at her but out across the pasture, and she could see by the set of his jaw that he was speaking from somewhere personal. "You know something about that," she said. "I have been running this place alone for 4 years," he said. "I have a couple of hired hands, but the decisions are mine. Sometimes that is fine. Sometimes it sits heavy." She understood that precisely. She nodded and they walked on. By the time they returned to where he had left his horse, the morning was gone and the midday heat was building. He watered his horse at her trough and she brought out a piece of cornbread and a cup of water, because she had been raised to offer hospitality even when it was modest, and he accepted it without making a performance of gratitude which she appreciated. "I will have my hands on that fence by Thursday," he said as he mounted. "I will watch from my side to make sure they do it properly," she said. He laughed, a real laugh, low and genuine. "I do not doubt you will," he said. He came back on Thursday, not just his hands. He came himself, with 2 hired men named Court and Diego, and the 4 of them worked the fence line in the Texas heat, replacing posts and stretching new wire, and Ida checked on them twice during the day on the pretense of inspecting the work on her side of the line, which was a transparent pretense, and everyone could see through it but no one said so. On his second visit from her side of the fence, he met her at the wire and they stood 3 feet apart with the fence between them and talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular: the progress of the work, the condition of the pasture grass, whether the creek would hold water through August this year. And when she finally said she had to get back to her own work, he said, "Same time next week, Miss Blackwell." She looked at him. "For what?" "For whatever needs attending to," he said. "I have found that this fence line benefits from regular inspection. The fence line has been neglected for years," she said. "One repair will not make regular inspection necessary." "Humor me," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, reading something in his gray eyes that was direct and honest and quietly hopeful, and she felt that same small interior thing she had dismissed as the consequence of skipping breakfast, except she had eaten breakfast today and she was no longer able to use that as an explanation. "Same time next week," she said, and turned and walked back toward her house. He was there the following Tuesday, at mid-morning. On the pretense of bringing over a coil of spare wire he thought she might be able to use for the section of her fence that ran along the road. It was a genuine and useful gift, practically delivered. He simply tied it to her fence post and left a brief note written in a clear, deliberate hand that said, "Spare wire from the repair. Should fit your road section. J. Hale." She used it that same afternoon, and while she was working the wire into position she found herself smiling for no particular reason she could identify. The following week he came to the fence line, and this time brought coffee in a tin canteen, still hot from the stove, which told her he had not had far to travel and had timed his departure carefully. She had, without admitting to herself that she was doing it, worn a cleaner blouse than strictly necessary, and spent an extra moment tying her hair back properly. They sat on the top rail of the fence, she on her side, he on his, and drank coffee and watched his cattle move across the far pasture and talked about everything and nothing. And Ida began to recognize the feeling she was developing with the same clarity and resignation with which a rancher recognizes an incoming weather system. There was nothing to be done about it, and the only sensible approach was to prepare accordingly. The summer deepened, and the visits became a regular occurrence that neither of them officially acknowledged as what it was. He came to her fence, or she came to his. One Saturday, he rode over on the pretense of needing to borrow a specific kind of hand tool that she somehow happened to have a fence stretcher that her father had ordered from a catalog years ago, and ended up staying for the middle part of the afternoon, helping her repair a section of her barn roof that had developed a worrying sag after the last hard rain. She watched him work from below, handing up materials when he needed them, and she noticed the way he worked, careful, methodical, not showy about it, doing things properly the first time so they would hold. When he came down from the ladder and brushed the sawdust off his shirt, she had already started a pot of beans and corn on the stove, and she invited him to stay for supper. He stayed. They ate at her small kitchen table with the evening light coming through the open window and the sounds of the land coming in with it, crickets starting up, the distant lowing of cattle, a night bird calling from the creek, and the conversation moved between practical and personal in the way that conversations do when two people are comfortable enough with each other to allow the transition. He told her about Missouri, about his parents, who were still alive and farming. He had two brothers, both still in Missouri, and his decision to come to Texas had been partly practical, and partly what he called an inability to fit into a shape that had already been decided. She understood that entirely. She told him about her mother, who had died when Ida was 11, and how it had been just her and her father after that, which had meant she learned to do everything because there was no one to divide the tasks with. She had learned to ride and mend fences and doctor sick animals and keep accounts and cook from her father, who believed that skills were skills regardless of which gender was acquiring them, which had been ahead of its time for Caldwell County, and had sometimes made her feel strange among the women her age in town, who had been raised toward other expectations. She was not bitter about this. It had made her who she was. But she acknowledged that it had made certain things complicated. "What things?" he asked. She looked at him across the table. The lamp was burning low between them and the night had come fully now, and there was a particular kind of honesty that comes with the late evening light. "People do not always know what to do with a woman who does not need things in the ways they expect," she said carefully. He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "Some people," he said. "Not everyone." She looked at him steadily. He met her eyes and held them, and the statement sat there between them with its full meaning available for acknowledgement if either of them chose to reach for it. She reached for it. "James," she said, first name, which she had not used before, and she felt him notice it. "What is it that you come over here for? because it has not been about fence wire for some time." He set the coffee cup down with a care that was very deliberate, and he looked at her with those gray eyes that were direct and honest, and she saw in them something that she recognized because it matched something in herself. "I come over here for you," he said, "if you are willing to hear that." The night insects were very loud and the lamp flame shifted in a breath of air from the window. Ida Blackwell, who was not a woman prone to dramatic gestures or unnecessary sentiment, felt something loosen in her chest that she had not realized had been tight. "I am willing to hear it," she said. He exhaled slowly. He picked up the coffee cup and set it down again without drinking from it, and she could see that this man who was unflappable about most things was finding this particular moment something other than easy, which she found made her trust him more rather than less. "I am not a man who does this well," he said, "talking about this kind of thing. I am better at showing than saying." "I know," she said. "I have been watching you show it for 2 months." He looked up at her and something in his expression shifted, a warmth moving in behind the careful control, and he said very quietly, "Is that acceptable to you, the way I am?" "James," she said, "I have been putting on a clean blouse every time I expected to see you for 2 months. What does that tell you about whether it is acceptable to me?" He laughed, that genuine low laugh she had come to look forward to more than she had admitted to herself. And the tension in the room dissolved into something warmer and easier, and they talked for another hour at that table, not about fences or cattle or practical things, but about themselves, about what they wanted, about what kind of life they were each trying to build out here on this raw, beautiful, difficult land. When he finally rose to leave and she walked him to his horse in the dark, he stopped at his stirrup and turned to look at her. The moon had come up and the light was silver and clean over the land. "May I call on you properly?" he said. "On Sunday. I would take you to town for dinner. The hotel restaurant is decent." "The hotel restaurant is not particularly decent," she said, "but the company makes the difference." "Is that a yes?" "That is a yes, James." He mounted, and she saw that he was smiling in the moonlight, that full, genuine smile that changed his face entirely. And he turned the horse toward his property and rode off through the silver dark. And Ida stood at her gate and watched him go and allowed herself, for just a moment, to feel the full size of what was happening. It was considerable. It was also, she had to admit, rather wonderful. Sunday he rode up to her house on the dark bay gelding at precisely the hour he had stated, and he had clearly made an effort. Clean shirt, the dark wool coat that she later learned he reserved for town occasions, his hat brushed, his boots polished. He had brought her a small bunch of wildflowers, yellow and orange, the kind that grew in the limestone cuts east of town, which told her that he had stopped and gathered them himself rather than purchasing them. And she found she preferred that considerably over anything from a shop. She had pressed her best dress and pinned her hair up, and she saw him take in the sight of her when she opened the door with the particular careful appreciation of a man who had decided to be very precise about what he expressed and when. "You look fine, Miss Blackwell," he said. "I thought we had moved past Miss Blackwell," she said. "You look fine, Ida," he said, and the use of her given name from his voice had a different quality than she had anticipated. More personal, more certain. They rode to Lockhart together, which was the county seat and the closest town of any substance, and they ate at the hotel dining room, which was indeed not particularly distinguished in its cooking, but had clean tablecloths and decent coffee, and they talked for 2 hours over their meal. They talked with the ease that had developed over months of fence-line conversations, but there was a new quality to it now, an acknowledgement of what they were doing, a deliberateness, a sense that they were both paying close attention to what they found. Several people in town noted their arrival and departure together, which in a county seat of modest size meant that by Monday morning there would be commentary. Neither of them particularly cared about this, which was something else they had in common. He walked her to her horse when they left, and he stood beside her at the hitching post and asked if she would come to supper at his place on Wednesday, and she said she would. She came on Wednesday and he cooked, not impressively, but competently, which was exactly what she expected, and his hired man Court made himself scarce with tact that suggested James had spoken to him about it, and Diego had his evening off. They ate at James's table, which was larger than hers, and the house had a particular quality she had not expected. It was clearly a man's house in its plainness and practicality, but it was carefully kept, and there were books on a shelf near the fireplace, several of them well read by the look of the spines, which told her something about him she added to the growing catalogue of things she was learning. After supper they sat on the front porch in the cooling evening and looked at the stars, which were extraordinary over the hill country on a clear August night, and James put his arm along the back of her chair, not around her, just along the back, a quiet offer, and she settled slightly toward him, and they sat like that for a long while without speaking, which was its own kind of conversation. In September the rains came back, which was a blessing after the dry summer, and James rode over in the middle of a particularly hard afternoon shower, because he had heard from his hired man Court, who had come back from town, that there was a section of Ida's roof over the main room that had not been fully repaired after the spring damage and might not hold in a sustained rain. He arrived to find her already dealing with the leak. She had put a bucket under it and moved her table and was making arrangements with the pragmatic calm of someone who has dealt with many such crises. And he spent the next 2 hours in the rain on her roof, fixing the problem properly while she handed tools up from below, both of them soaked through. And afterward she made strong hot tea and they sat by her small fireplace and dried out and talked and laughed about it, and it was one of the better evenings she had spent in her life, though she would not have said so aloud just yet. But she was thinking about it, about him, about the shape of what this was becoming and whether she wanted it to become it fully. She did. She found that when she examined the question directly, without the practical hedging she normally applied to things that felt uncertain, the answer was simply yes. She wanted this. She wanted him. She wanted to not be alone on this land anymore. Not because she couldn't manage alone, because she had proven she could, but because there was a quality to sharing it with someone like James Hale that made everything larger and better, and that was not weakness. That was just honesty. She suspected he had arrived at a similar place, because he was not a man who wasted time on things he had not thought through, and he had been very consistent in his attentions. It was in October, on an evening when the air had finally turned cool and carried the first real suggestion of winter, that he said something definitive. They were sitting on his porch again after she had come over for supper, wrapped in the particular quiet of a clear, cool night, and he turned to look at her with an expression that was more serious than his usual reserved warmth. "Ida," he said, "I want to talk to you about something." "All right," she said. He was quiet for a moment, as if arranging his words with the same care he gave to his fence lines and his accounts. "I know that you are a woman who is entirely capable of managing on your own," he said. "I know that you do not need someone to come in and take over your life or your land or your decisions. That is not what I am suggesting. What I am saying is that I have thought about this very carefully, and I think that you and I could build something together that would be better than either of us building it alone. Not because either of us is lacking, but because some things are just made better by two." She was very still. The night wind moved through the cedars below the porch, and the stars were sharp and close. "Are you asking me to marry you?" she said. He reached into his shirt pocket and placed something on the arm of her chair, a small plain ring, gold, with a single small turquoise stone that was sky blue and bright even in the low light of the porch lamp. He had ridden to San Antonio for it, she would later learn, because he had wanted something that was not the ordinary thing, and he had thought the color suited her, the clarity and the directness of it. "I am asking you to marry me," he said. "If you want. There is no pressure here, Ida. I want this to be what you choose, not what you feel obligated toward." She looked at the ring on the arm of her chair for a moment. She looked at him. He was watching her with a careful steadiness that she recognized as someone holding himself very still because the answer mattered enormously, and he did not want to influence it by the weight of his wanting. "James," she said, "I rode onto your property 2 months ago to return a calf. I did not anticipate that it would come to this." "Neither did I," he said. "I am glad it did," she said. She picked up the ring and held it in her palm and looked at it, and then she looked at him and saw in his face the full depth of what he felt, which was not the kind of shallow enthusiasm that fades quickly, but the solid, unhurried kind that lasts. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." She saw his breath leave him, a slow exhale, as if he had been holding it without realizing, and he reached over and took her hand with both of his, and she felt the warmth and the steadiness of his grip and thought that this was exactly right. He slid the ring onto her finger. The turquoise caught the lamplight and glowed. They sat on the porch for a long time that night, talking about what came next, making plans the way both of them liked to make plans, practically, specifically, with attention to what needed to be done. There were questions about the land, about Ida's property, about how they would combine their operations. James said right away that her land stayed hers, that they would run the two operations together, but she would keep her name on the deed, which in 1878 Texas was not the obvious choice, and she knew it. "My father built that land," she said. "I have no intention of losing the Blackwell name from it." "Nor do I," he said firmly. "Blackwell land stays Blackwell land. We will just work it together." She looked at him with something that was very close to the feeling she imagined she was supposed to feel when someone said exactly the right thing. "You are a remarkable man, James Hale," she said. He shook his head. "I am a practical man who found a remarkable woman and had the sense to do something about it," he said. They were married in December, in Lockhart, at the Methodist Church, which neither of them attended regularly, but which seemed like the appropriate place to make a thing official. The ceremony was small. Ida had no family living, and James's family was in Missouri and could not make the journey in winter, though his mother sent a letter that made Ida cry a little when she read it, which she would not admit to anyone. But the church was full enough with their neighbors and acquaintances. Court and Diego came cleaned up and respectful, and the minister did not take too long. And when James said his part, his voice was steady, and he kept his eyes on Ida the entire time. She had made herself a new dress for the occasion, deep blue wool, with a small lace collar, and she had worn her hair down under her good hat. And James had looked at her when she came up the aisle with an expression that she kept in her memory like a particular stone in a pocket, a thing you could take out and feel the weight of whenever you needed it. Afterward there was a dinner at the hotel, better than the first dinner they had eaten there together, and several of the ranching families from around the county came, and there was fiddle music, and more than one person made a toast, and it was a good evening. Ida and James left before the dancing got too long and ridden home together in the cold December dark to the house that was now theirs together, with the lamp lit in the window that Court had left burning for them, and the stars over the Texas hill country that were exactly as he had described them to her all those months ago, bigger than anywhere else, or at least it felt that way. They settled into married life with the same practical good sense that had characterized everything they had done since that first morning on the porch with coffee. There were adjustments, as there are always adjustments when two people who have been entirely independent for years decide to share space and time and decisions, but the adjustments were navigated with humor, and with the established habits of communication they had already built during their courtship. They disagreed about things. Ida thought they should expand the cattle operation more quickly than James's cautious approach would allow. James thought she was taking on too much of the physical work herself and needed to hire seasonal help. But they disagreed the way two people do who have decided to build something together, and therefore work out their differences rather than around them. The first big project they undertook together was expanding her barn, which was too small for the combined operation. They planned it together through February, ordered the lumber and hardware, and in the spring James and Court and Diego and 2 men hired from town worked it up over 2 weeks while Ida kept the construction fed and the rest of the operation running. When the new barn was finished and she walked into it with the smell of fresh-cut timber and the afternoon light coming through the new windows, she stood in the middle of it and felt a deep satisfaction that was half about the barn and half about the fact that she had someone to build it with. Spring brought new calves, a good number on both the Blackwell property and the Hale land, which they had begun to think of as one entity even if the deeds remained separate. And the work was relentless but generative, the kind of work that builds something real. James was up before dawn every day and Ida was up with him, and they worked the land together with a complementary efficiency that surprised even them. In April, a man rode onto the property claiming that a section of Ida's south pasture was actually on a land grant he held from a previous owner, predating her father's claim. It was a common enough dispute in Texas in those years. Land records were often confused, and there were men who made a business of pressing questionable claims. James read the man's paperwork carefully and said very little, and then rode to Lockhart the next day with copies of Ida's father's original filing and a determination in his jaw that Ida recognized as the quiet face he wore when he had decided something needed to be resolved. He retained a lawyer, a sharp-minded man named Price who handled land disputes, and within 6 weeks the claim was dismissed as unfounded, the man's paperwork having been found to describe a different parcel entirely. It cost money they would rather not have spent, but Ida's south pasture was secure. When James came home with the news, she was in the kitchen making biscuits for supper, and she turned from the stove with flour on her hands and he told her, and she crossed the room and put her floury hands on either side of his face and kissed him, which left white handprints on his jaw that made both of them laugh. That was a good evening. Many of them were. In the summer, word came from Missouri that James's father had taken ill, not life-threatening, but serious enough that James felt he should go. They discussed it carefully. The round trip would take 3 weeks at minimum. It was a complicated time to be away from the operation, but family was family. "You should go," Ida said. "I will manage the place." "I know you will manage it," he said. "That is not why I hesitate. I do not want to leave you for 3 weeks. She had looked at him and felt something move through her that was not just affection but its deeper and more settled version. "I will still be here when you come back," she said. "The cattle will still be here. Go see your father." He went. He was gone 22 days. She managed the property with the help of Court and Diego and the seasonal men, and she kept thorough notes on everything that happened so she could report it to him when he returned. His father improved, which was the important thing. When James came back, riding through the gate at dusk on a Tuesday, she was in the corral checking a heifer's leg that had been favoring since the previous week, and she heard the gate and looked up and saw him and set down what she was doing and walked out to meet him, and he got down from his horse and held her for a long moment without saying anything, and that was entirely sufficient. His parents came to visit in October of that year. His father, recovered, and his mother, who was a compact, energetic woman named Ruth, who assessed Ida in the first 5 minutes with the frank thoroughness of a woman who loves her son and wants to know who he has chosen. Ida bore the assessment without flinching because she had nothing to hide, and by the second day, Ruth had attached herself to Ida with a warm practicality that bypassed social formality entirely and went straight to the simple fact that she liked her. She told Ida so directly, which was where James had gotten his habit of speaking plainly. "My son writes about you with more feeling than he has about anything since he was 14 and got his first horse," Ruth told her one morning while they were making breakfast together. "I am glad you are what he wrote." Ida laughed. "He writes home about me." "Every letter," Ruth said, and went back to the eggs. James's father, Henry, was a quiet man very like James, and he spent most of the visit looking at the land with the assessing eye of a farmer who knows quality when he sees it. On his last morning, he found Ida in the barn doing the morning check, and he stood for a moment watching her work and then said simply, "You take good care of it." "I try to," she said. "You do," he said. "He is lucky." He nodded once, in the economical way of men of his generation, and went back to the house, and Ida stood in the barn for a moment with a feeling she could not quite name, which was somewhere in the territory of belonging. It was during their second winter of marriage that Ida discovered she was expecting a child. She told James on a February evening, sitting at the table after supper, with the fire burning low and the wind off the north coming under the door in that way it had. She told him with the directness she brought to everything, watching his face for the response, already knowing it would be something real and worth watching. He was quiet for a full moment. Then he got up from his chair and came around the table and knelt down beside her chair and took her hand, and he looked at her with those gray eyes that she had known for nearly 2 years now and understood as well as she understood her own pasture land, every variation, every shift. "Are you well?" he said first, which was the right question, and she loved him for it being the first one. "I am perfectly well," she said, "strong as usual." He let out a slow breath, and a smile crossed his face that was different from all his other smiles, wider, softer, something in it she had not seen before. "We are going to need a bigger table," he said, and she laughed until her eyes watered. The pregnancy was healthy and unremarkable in the way that healthy pregnancies are, not without discomfort, not without the particular exhaustion of the first months, but straightforward. And Ida was constitutionally unsuited to being unwell for long, which helped. James watched over her with a care that was neither suffocating nor dismissive. He did not treat her like she was made of glass, because he knew better than that and also knew she would not tolerate it, but he absorbed extra work without discussion and made sure there was always hot food available, and never once complained about the nights she could not sleep comfortably. In the summer, early on a morning in July when the sky was already hot and white at 7 o'clock, Ida gave birth to their first child. The midwife from town, a capable woman named Mrs. Faber, was there, and James was outside the door for all of it, which was the convention, and Ida could hear him pacing at certain points, which she found both touching and slightly amusing. The baby was a boy. They named him Frank, for Ida's father, with Henry as his middle name for James's father, which made both grandfathers pleased when the letters arrived. Frank Henry Hale came into the world with dark hair and a set of lungs that announced his presence to the immediate vicinity, and James held him that first evening with an expression on his face that Ida had never seen on any face before, entirely unguarded, completely without the careful restraint that was so characteristic of him, something more naked and more profound than anything else she had watched him feel. She watched him look at his son and felt in herself the particular happiness that comes not just from your own happiness, but from watching someone you love be completely happy. "Hello," James said to the baby, very quietly, as if introducing himself. "I am your father." Frank blinked at him with the unfocused blue eyes of the newborn. "He has your eyes," James said to Ida. "Every baby has blue eyes," she said, still tired but fundamentally well. "These ones are going to stay," he said with certainty. He was right. They turned gray like his father's by the time 3 months had passed. Life with a baby on a working ranch required adjustments that no amount of planning quite prepares you for, and Ida and James made those adjustments with the combination of pragmatism and humor that had characterized their whole partnership. There were hard nights and harder mornings and stretches where the fatigue was bone deep, and everything seemed like too much, and they moved through those stretches by dividing the burden and not making it worse by complaining about what could not be changed. Court, who turned out to have a surprising affinity for children, occasionally minded Frank in the mornings, while Ida got the more demanding outdoor work done. Diego brought gifts, small carved wooden animals that he had made himself in the evenings, a skill no one had known he possessed. and it became a minor but consistent joy to see what new carving would appear tied to the baby's basket when no one was looking. Frank grew with the land, brown and sturdy and curious. He was walking before his first year was out and running before he was 18 months, and his first clear word was horse, delivered with the decisive confidence of someone who has identified a priority. He was a serious child in some ways and a joyful one in others, with a tendency to watch everything carefully before engaging with it that James recognized as his own habit at an early age and found both amusing and slightly humbling. When Frank was 2, Ida was expecting again. This time she told James while they were both out checking the south fence line, the original site of all of it, the first fence she had ever walked with him, and the absurd rightness of the location made her smile before she even said the words. "Again," he said, and there was nothing in his voice but warmth. "Again," she said. He reached over and took her hand there on the fence line and squeezed it once, and they stood together in the afternoon light with the cedar and the grass around them, and the sound of their cattle in the middle distance. And Ida thought about that morning 3 years ago when she had ridden through this gap with a bawling calf on a rope lead, with no idea what was waiting for her on the other side. Their second child was a girl, born in the spring. They named her Ruth Clara for both grandmothers, and she came into the world with less drama than her brother but no less certainty, a small decisive person from her first hour. She had Ida's dark hair and James's steady gray eyes, and a temperament that suggested she had already made up her mind about most things and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. Frank was fascinated by his sister, with the particular intensity of a small person who has been the only child and now has something new and compelling to examine. He spent considerable time standing next to her basket simply looking at her, occasionally offering her his carved wooden horse, which she was initially unable to receive but that he left nearby anyway as a courtesy. The years settled into themselves, rich and full and varied. The ranch grew carefully, at the pace James believed in and Ida had come to appreciate, not overextended, not reckless but steady. They added cattle, expanded their hay operation, and eventually built a second horse corral on the Blackwell side of the property to accommodate the horses they were beginning to raise, which had been Ida's idea and which proved to be a sound business decision. Court married a woman from Gonzales County, a sensible, cheerful woman named Me who became a neighbor and a friend, and moved into a small house he built on the north edge of the property. Diego eventually moved on to his own land further south, which was as it should be, and they hired 2 new hands over the years, men who were competent and decent, and added to the particular community that the Hale Blackwell operation had become. James's parents came south for a second visit when Ruth Clara was an infant, and they saw the full extent of what their son had built, and what Ida had built alongside him, and Henry Hale, who was not a demonstrative man, put his hand on his son's shoulder when they were walking the pasture one afternoon and said quietly, "You did well, James, in all of it." And James, who had also not been raised to make much of such moments, simply said, "I know." But Ida, who was walking a few paces behind them, saw the way his head came up and the set of his shoulders changed, and she filed that image away in the collection of things she loved about him. There were hard years, too, as there are always hard years on the land. In 1883, the drought came back with a particular vengeance, and the creek stayed dry from June through September, and they lost 6 head, and the hay crop was half what it should have been, and they had to make difficult decisions about what to carry through the winter and what to sell. James and Ida sat at the kitchen table with the account spread between them many evenings that summer and fall, working through the numbers, making the decisions that needed making. There were nights when the worry sat heavy and neither of them had easy solutions, and they carried those nights together the way they had decided to carry everything, not pretending it was fine when it was not, but not despairing either. "We built this before with less than we have now," Ida said one particularly hard evening in August, when the thermometer had not gone below 90 even after dark and the pasture was brown and crackling. "We will rebuild whatever the drought takes." "Yes," he said. He had the accounts open and a pencil in his hand, and he was looking at her across the table. "I know we will." He paused. "I am glad you are who you are," he said. "I mean that specifically. Someone else would be useless to me right now. You are not." She looked at him with a warmth that the drought and the worry and the heat could not touch. "That is possibly the most romantic thing you have ever said to me," she said. He tilted his head. "I can do better than that if the circumstances allow." "The circumstances will allow again," she said. "We just need to get through August." They got through August. They got through September and October and the long, cautious winter. And in the spring the rains came back and the creek ran full again, and the pastures recovered with the resilience of Texas land that has been treated well enough to forgive its hard years. They rebuilt the herd to its previous strength within 2 seasons, and then exceeded it. And the horse operation they had developed proved a crucial source of income during the lean period, which vindicated Ida's original instinct considerably. Frank, at 6 years old, was already following James around the property in the mornings, with a seriousness of purpose that made both his parents work to keep straight faces. He had inherited James's deliberateness of movement and Ida's capacity for focused observation, and he watched everything with enormous attention, asking questions that were sometimes startlingly perceptive for a child of his age. James took him riding properly for the first time that spring up on his own horse, a small gentle chestnut that they had trained specifically to be patient, and Frank sat the saddle with a natural ease that made James come inside that evening and say to Ida simply, "He is going to be good at this," with the quiet satisfaction of a man watching something come forward that he had hoped for. Ruth Clara, at 4, was interested in everything that Frank was interested in, and also in several additional things, including the kitchen garden, which she had decided was her domain, and which she managed with a combination of enthusiasm and extremely questionable methodology that nonetheless produced results. She had planted corn in a completely random pattern one spring, and the result had been a small but productive chaos of corn plants that she tended with passionate dedication and harvested with immense pride. Ida taught both children to read early, using the books from James's shelf and everything she had herself, because she believed that literacy was not optional, and James backed this entirely. On winter evenings they sat around the fire, both children, James and Ida, and read together, taking turns, and it was in those evenings that Ida felt most clearly what had been built. Not just the land and the cattle and the houses and the barns, but this. The particular warmth of a family that had been made from choice, from 2 people who had looked at each other clearly and decided, "Yes, this is the one, this is what I want." One evening in the late autumn, the children were in bed and the house was quiet, with the particular quality of quiet that only exists after children have been put to sleep. Ida and James sat on the porch in their usual way, with the cool air and the stars and the cedar smell coming up from the draw, and she said to him, "Do you remember the morning I brought that calf back?" "Every detail," he said. She looked at him. "What made you ask me in for coffee?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. "I watched you handle that animal," he said. "The way you worked it, patient and steady, no roughness, completely sure of what you needed to do. And I thought, that is someone I want to know. That right there." He paused. "And then you got on your horse and I looked at the way you sat in the saddle and I thought, that is more than someone I want to know." He turned to look at her. "I had made up my mind before you had said 10 words to me." Ida felt that thing in her chest that she had felt since almost the beginning, that was neither simple nor complicated but both simultaneously. "You made a good decision," she said. "The best one I have ever made," he said, without hesitation. She reached over and took his hand, and he folded his fingers around hers in the way that was so familiar by now, so entirely known, and they sat together looking at the Texas sky and the land that was theirs, built from work and patience, and two people who had been honest with each other from the first. Their third child came in the summer of 1885, another boy, born with red hair that astonished everyone, a characteristic that James traced back to his maternal grandmother, and that Ida accepted with the equanimity she brought to most surprises. They named him William, after no one in particular, simply because it suited him, and he came into the world with the same red-faced urgency of all new arrivals and immediately established himself as a person of considerable opinions, expressed loudly and frequently. Frank, at 9, regarded his new brother with the philosophical acceptance of the eldest child, and Ruth Clara, at 7, appointed herself William's primary guardian and enthusiast, a role she took with complete seriousness. James watched his 3 children moving around the property the following spring, Frank following him to the morning work, Ruth Clara directing William in some project in the kitchen garden that involved more dirt than was strictly necessary, Ida coming across the yard from the barn with a bucket in each hand and her hair escaping its braid in the way it always did by mid-morning, and he stood still for a moment and simply took it in. Ida saw him standing still and came over to him, set her buckets down, followed his line of sight to the children. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Only this." She looked at him and understood. She put her arm through his and leaned against him slightly, and they stood together for a moment watching their children and their land and their life, which had been made from a morning when a young woman had ridden through a gap in a fence with a bawling calf, and a quiet man had watched her work and made a decision. The land around them was gold and green with the early summer, the cedar was fragrant in the warm air, and the sky over the Texas hill country was enormous, the way James had always said it was, the way it had drawn him here from Missouri all those years ago, as if it had known he was coming, as if there had been a particular piece of it with a particular shape of life waiting to be filled. Everything that needed to be built had been built. Everything that needed to be found had been found. Ida Blackwell, Ida Hale, though she kept Blackwell on the deed and always would stood on the land her father had claimed and her own work had expanded, and the partnership she had made with the man beside her had made flourish, and she felt, with the full weight of everything that word contained, that she was home, not just in the place but in the life, not just in the land but in the choosing. In the fact that 2 people who had each been doing the hard work alone had looked at each other one ordinary morning over a returned calf and a cup of coffee, and had both had the sense to say yes to what was right in front of them. In the years that followed, and there were many of them, good ones, the kind that accumulate and make the world seem reliable, the Hale Blackwell Ranch became known in Caldwell County for the quality of its horses particularly, which were sought after by ranchers from 3 counties over, and which Ida managed with a particular skill and attention that made her the acknowledged authority in the area. James's cattle operation had grown to something substantial, and Frank, who came into his own as a young man with the same steadiness and patience as his father and the same clear-eyed assessment as his mother, was already learning the full extent of the business by his mid-teens, with an evident intention to continue it. Ruth Clara, as it turned out, had her grandfather Frank's quality of belief in the land and the things it could produce, and she developed an interest in the medicinal plants of the region that she had begun cataloging with a thoroughness that reminded everyone who saw it of her mother with an account book detailed, precise, completely without wasted effort. James had ridden to Austin specifically to find books that might support her interest, which she had received with the same passionate dedication she gave everything she cared about. William, the red-haired youngest, was a different matter, entirely quick and funny, and sociable where his siblings were more contained, with a gift for talking to people that made him useful in town business and hopeless at the patient, solitary work of fence inspection. James found this amusing, and Ida found it both amusing and practically inconvenient, but they loved him entirely as he was, which was all that was ever required. Court and me had children of their own, and those children grew up alongside the Hale children in the particular community of a working ranch, and it became its own kind of extended family, not blood but chosen, which is sometimes stronger. Diego came back through one summer, heading north for reasons he kept to himself, and stayed 3 weeks and carved William a set of wooden animals that the boy treasured extravagantly, and that sat on the shelf in his room for years. James and Ida celebrated 10 years of marriage in December of 1888 in the same Methodist church in Lockhart, where they had been married. At a dinner, arranged by their children and Court and me, that was more substantial than their original wedding dinner had been and considerably louder, owing to the presence of 3 children and various neighbors, and the fiddle player from town who had apparently been engaged for the occasion, without either of the principals knowing about it. James stood up at that dinner and said a few words, which was not his habit and which therefore made them more meaningful, and what he said was essentially simple: that he had spent much of his adult life as a careful man who did not rush into things, who liked to see the full dimensions of something before committing to it, and that the best thing he had ever done was the morning he had looked at a woman riding across his pasture and known immediately, with a certainty that bypassed all his caution, that this was the one. He said that everything good in his life since that morning had grown from that moment, and that he was grateful every day. Ida listened to this and kept her composure, which took some effort, and when she stood to respond, she said only that she had gone that morning to return a calf, which was a simple thing and the right thing to do, and that it had turned into the best morning of her life without her having had any plan for that to happen, and that was something she thought about whenever she was inclined to be too controlling about outcomes. Sometimes things that are simply right arrange themselves if you let them. The fiddle struck up after that, and the dancing went on until quite late, and Frank danced with his mother, and Ruth Clara danced with her father, and William danced with everyone indiscriminately, and it was a good evening, a full one, the kind that marks time properly. Later, riding home under the December stars with the children sleepy in the wagon behind them and the hill country dark and clear around them, James took Ida's hand on the wagon seat and said quietly, "You are the best thing I know." She leaned her head against his shoulder and looked up at the enormous Texas sky. "You are the best thing I know," she said, "and I have assessed the available options thoroughly." He laughed. There in the cold dark with their children half asleep behind them and their land ahead and their whole life still going forward. And his laugh was the one she had loved from the first, low and genuine and entirely himself. And she felt the full sum of it. The calf and the coffee and the fence line and the October evening and the ring and the years and the children and the work and the hard times and the good ones and all of it. Everything they had made together, everything they were still making. The horses moved at an easy pace through the night. The stars were enormous. They were going home.